Well, guys, it's one of our favourite topics to talk about. And we know that because every time we do an expansion video, we get so many views. And so what we thought today, we could just go through the expansion teams that have been in or were a part of the A-League across its foundation, since its foundation to the current day. There's quite a few teams. We'll just go through in chronological order. We're not going to include the debut to the teams that featured in the inaugural A-League because I don't think that really counts. So it'll be everything from onwards. But before we go on, Samuel, do you want to do the things?
Do the things.
Like, subscribe.
Hey, you should definitely like this video if you like talking about A-League expansion, and if you like hearing about all things A-League, click the subscribe button. Look, I can't even say it. We need you to subscribe so we can up our production value. Obviously, get into it.
And you've got to make a promise now. If your team is an expansion team, or if it's not an expansion team, you have to like the video. So anyway, let's go on. So obviously we started the A-League back in the season of 2005-06, and we had 8 inaugural teams. We had one from Sydney FC, we had the Newcastle Jets, we had the Central Coast Mariners, we had the then Queensland Roar, we had Melbourne Victory, the New Zealand Knights, we had the Perth Glory, and Adelaide United. So I think Adelaide United, Perth, and Newcastle Jets were in the old NSL. The New Zealand Knights are not a continuisation of Football Kings. They are separate entities. People say all the time on Twitter it's the same club. They're not. Anyway, we'll move on from that. So speaking of New Zealand, the New Zealand Knights, they were the first team to ever leave the comp. So they played 2 seasons in the A-League, and then they were joined in season 3 back in 2007 by the Wellington Phoenix, who are still with us to this very day. So let's start with the Wellington. Pardon?
Quick note on the Knights. They were trash. They were so bad that rightfully got booted from the A-League.
Yeah.
It's just woeful.
Yeah. And they didn't even play in Auckland. They played in Albany, just outside of Auckland, North Harbour Stadium. Anyway, so let's talk about the Wellington Phoenix, the first expansion team. I think they've been a pretty decent success. They've been stable. They've been consistent. Hello, Kat. What are your thoughts on Wellington? Because I don't know if you're a big fan of a New Zealand team in the comp. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, look, you're right. I think, look, if it was down to me, I would not have New Zealand teams in the league. That being said, they do bring some flavour to the A-League. I think in recent kind of seasons, they've actually put to shame a couple of the different A-League teams with the crowds that they get. Like, they played in Auckland for the first time in a while on the weekend, and there's 10,000 people there. Like, MacArthur, hang your head in shame. So I do think they have been a success, the Wellington Phoenix. They've never really had a season where you've gone, they could win the A-League, though. But that's not all there is to a football team. Like, we know that. And I think just the culture around the Knicks, the fact that it looked like they might have lost their license at some stage, and the rallying that the whole competition got behind them, not just New Zealand fans, but actually the whole competition rallied to save the Knicks.
Hashtag save
I
the
think
Knicks.
things like that. I think things like that show you their value in the competition. And I think for me that the greatest addition they've actually given to the A-League is shirts off at 80 minutes. Like, watching it against my team on the weekend hurt, but it's beautiful. Like, I think the cake team.
What part's beautiful? The guts or just the vibe?
Yeah, it's full on big grown men next to little kids, and they're just whipping their shirts off. Like, it's just a sight to behold. No, legitimately, I think they have been a success. I think they've got a real culture behind them, and I actually kind of see them growing and growing and growing. I think currently under Ufuk Talay is the most stable they've been in their history, the most kind of stable results wise as well, but just as a football club. So yeah, I think they've been great.
Yeah, no, I've always enjoyed them. I always write them off in terms of their performance on the field, and they continue to just even this season. I think they're probably safe for the finals. So yeah, good on Wellington. So we've deemed them a success. Speaking of success, 2009, Gold Coast United and North Queensland Fury. Boy, where to begin with these teams? These were, I think, were mooted as an expansion to do with the World Cup bid. We want to try and expand to these venues to get upgraded venues with the World Cup, and obviously that failed, and then in turn those teams failed. I think North Queensland lasted 2 seasons, Gold Coast lasted 3. Let's start with North Queensland. I don't know exactly what to say. I think it was money in the end that they just could not afford to run a team. Similar to the Newcastle Jets, but there was no kind teams to prop them up back then. What were your thoughts on Newcastle? Do you remember them that much?
North Queensland. Look, they started well. Robbie Fowler as a marquee signing to start off a team. Brilliant. Green kits. Oh, beautiful. Even like where they were playing, it wasn't too big for them up in North Queensland. And imagine if they were still around today to play in that new North Queensland stadium.
Yeah.
Like it'd be a pretty awesome away day.
The thing about where they played their games at was out in the suburbs. That new stadium's like right in the centre of Townsville, near South Townsville, right near the station, all that kind of stuff.
And that was actually a big talking point around the fall down of North Queensland. That old stadium was heaps far away. There was not great public transport to it. And that kind of showed in their crowds. That being said, I don't think their crowds, you're the crowd man, Bradley. I don't think their crowds were that bad if you compare them to the new expansion teams we've got.
Yeah. For the era, I think for the era they weren't particularly great, but I think MacArthur and Weston could do with a bit of a prop. So their first season, they averaged 6,723. So at the time, that was the third lowest in the comp. So Gold Coast was worse and Newcastle Jets were worse. So listen, I think if Weston and MacArthur could pull 6,000 on average, they'd be laughing.
Be really happy, at this stage.
So I don't think that's particularly bad for, not necessarily it's a decent sized city, but I assume it's smaller than the likes of Newcastle, but it is, and smaller than the Gold Coast.
I think those kind of things show that they absolutely had potential. With a few more things that went right, maybe Australia gets to host the World Cup and they actually do redo that stadium in the city earlier, and that promise is there for North Queensland. Maybe that injects some money. People get behind it because they know there's longevity. Really, in the end, and this is probably true of Gold Coast as well, I think the pin was pulled too early. And you looked at where the league was, you can understand why. But if you look at someone like a Newcastle Jets, who other clubs are propping up now and things like that, wasn't an option back then. The FFA, as they were at the time, they weren't keen to do that. I think it was a little bit rash to pull the pin. And look, maybe Gold Coast is somebody that comes up in conversations now a little bit more. Maybe they had the brighter of the futures between them and North Queensland, but I think it's a real shame that they ended up folding. What, 2 seasons did they get, or 3?
Yeah, the Fury got 2, Gold Coast United got 3. I think it's a shame that both those teams folded, because I think they both had potential, and once things got a bit tough, the FFA back then just weren't, I don't think, willing to prop them up and try and fight for them, because I think they could have worked. I think Gold Coast United, Clive Palmer, what a man. And
look, maybe that's a transition. I think North Queensland Fury had some issues in the club that saw it go down. Gold Coast had an issue.
Yeah. So the problem with North Queensland, I think, was an owner or something pulled out, or a big investor pulled out, and so their future really struggled with a lack of funds. Gold Coast United had no lack of funds through Clive Palmer. It was just Clive Palmer was such a nuisance to the fans, shutting down corners of the stadium and stuff like that, and being himself, I think, drove a lot of fans away, which is a real shame, because Have we? Yeah, yeah, it's a real bummer. And the A League at that time was in potential a bit of a lull. Had these two teams joined the comp 4 or 5 years later, around 2013-14, I think they would have enjoyed a lot more success and would have boomed a lot better on the wave of the success the A League was having. So
That's right. If you don't pull the pin on them as early, what? Who's the next team that comes in? Wanderers?
Melbourne City or Melbourne Heart.
Melbourne Heart. Okay. And Wanderers not far behind. And you
Mm.
look at the trajectory of those clubs. Now, Melbourne City, fan base wise, maybe hasn't grown as much. But as a team, and we'll get onto this later. But I think if you keep North Queensland and Gold Coast and then add a Heart and a Wanderers on top, I think the league brings them up. I think the league, they grow with the league, and the opportunity to bring in kind of bigger marquees comes in, the financial kind of backing stays. So yeah, look, I think with both it's a real shame. Gold Coast, I guess if we stay on them for a little bit, like again, you look at the stadium they had there in the Gold Coast. Okay, it was too big for them at the time. It's not the biggest stadium in the world though. Like
It's
it could be
27,000. That's something you can build towards filling. Well, not
absolutely
filling, but being a comfortable home.
10,000 in that is,
I think that'd be
uh,
fine.
pretty decent. And it was, an all enclosed stadium. You get a good atmosphere there. The Gold Coast just never really got the opportunity to build something.
Yeah.
And yeah, look, Clive Palmer absolutely is part of that. He went a bit wacky. He used them as a political kind
Went
of
always. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
was a bit wacky. He used them as a political kind of front to get some of his ideas of, and that was really unfortunate. If you have different owner with the same amount of financial backing, maybe things look different for the Gold Coast nowadays.
Yeah.
But like they had some great players. I think one of the players who stands out for me is Roy. Oh, I can't even remember his name now. Don't worry.
They had Shane Smeltz there.
Ben Smelts was great for them.
And
Yep.
who's the fellow that's like on the Adelaide board now? See him on commentating a bit. It's killing me.
On the Adelaide board.
Adelaide United CEO. I don't think he's a CEO. I can't think of him. Think of his name.
Bruce Gide?
Bruce Juday. Yeah, I swear they had Bruce Juday for a bit.
Bruce Gide. They had Michael Thwaite as well.
Yeah,
He
Bruce
was
Juday
an
was
interesting
Gold Coast. Yeah,
character.
Michael Thwaite. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they had some really good players in
Yeah.
their couple of seasons. They had some really good young players come through.
Hmm.
It was the youngest captain for them. Now it's going to drive me crazy. What was his name?
Yeah, I saw this the other day. That was when like Clive Palmer like cleaned out half the squad and stuff like that. But I cannot remember who your captain was, but I was just looking at some of the teams. Jason Kalina played for him. Bas van der Beek,
Ben
Ben
Halloran,
Halloran. Yeah, there you go.
Adama
Michael Thwaite.
Traore,
Adama
apparently.
Traore at the Wanderers still going. I can't think of any other current A-League player that once played for Gold Coast United. Glenn Moss.
Mitch Cooper was the player I was thinking
Mitch
of.
Cooper. Okay.
Vanuatu, but he was like really young, got given the captain's band for a while.
Josh
Um,
Brillante played for Gold Coast United.
so like that's what I'm saying. Like they had an interesting squad. They made the finals one of their seasons. Like
Yeah, their
if you
first two, I think they finished third, and I think one year they got within a game of the grand final.
yeah, it's like a real shame. So I would obviously they have to go down as failures because if you can't, but I don't think it was a bad spot for an expansion team. I
Yeah,
think they got killed by external factors and
yeah.
a bit of yeah early kind of knee-jerk reaction from the FFA. Probably wouldn't happen nowadays.
Yeah, I think for me, North Queensland's a sad failure, and Gold Coast is a very tremendous failure, just in the manner it all went down in the end.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but for sure, yeah, I agree. Those places can sustain teams. Just a bit more time should have been their thing. We move on to 2010 and Melbourne Heart / Melbourne City. So, still, man, it's 13 years ago, and I don't know if I was No, like, yeah, I don't know if I was that into the A League back then, but I think it was based on the fact that the success of Melbourne Victory, and they wanted another team in Melbourne, and so it was the Heart. Actually, no, I reckon we're reading here. Melbourne Victory announced they would not play at Amy Park unless it had a capacity of 30,000. So the government suggested a second Melbourne team could play there, and then yeah,
Right.
Melbourne Heart came there, and obviously a few years later they got bought by Manchester City and became Melbourne City. Um, I
Now,
don't know.
controversy. Does that make two different expansion teams? Is City the same as Heart? Are they? I'm maybe
I would say they are
poking around a
because
little bit.
it's the same club that's been rebranded.
Yeah,
But I
absolutely.
guess you could make that argument. It could be a different club, but we're not going to do that, are we?
Now, Melbourne Heart. My dad is. He jumped on the Melbourne Heart train, like not from Melbourne at all. Goes there very
Yeah.
occasionally. For some reason, jumped on Melbourne Heart
Oh
and
well, good
made
on
them
him.
his team.
Yep.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision. And early on, look, there were not many bright spots in their first couple of seasons. And really,
No.
without the Melbourne City purchase, they may have gone the same way as Gold Coast and North Queensland. Let's be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah. Who
Like
knows?
they
Um,
they weren't looking great. The crowds weren't fantastic. So many people were victory supporters that not not many, if any, jumped ship. And you know, they just and they've kind of struggled with this ever since. Like they've never really had a solid fan base, and I'm not really sure why that is. Because as Heart, they were exciting. It was a Melbourne derby. There was something cool about it. The red and white striped kits were beautiful. Bathurst Athletic.
yeah.
Just
Yeah.
look at those jerseys. Um, there was a lot to like about the club. Craig Goodwin playing as a left back, making his debut. Oh,
Hmm.
beautiful. And now you look at them and they're, Melbourne City, well, one of the most successful clubs footballing wise. Like you look at the football they play, it's beautiful. Paddy Kisnorbo's now gone overseas because of what he was
Hmm.
able to do with that team. Some of the players they've developed, like real good football team. And so they're this kind of weird case where everything looks right. Like as a football team, it looks right, and yet they just don't get the support, and I'm not sure why. Like I'd love to
Yeah.
hear from people down in Melbourne why you think Melbourne Heart has just never really grabbed people.
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a good question. So if you don't know, I run the A League crowds Twitter page, and it seems every week when I post the City home crowd, it's the same people moaning, complaining. Why don't they pull bigger crowds? A team this good should have massive crowds.
Hmm.
I think they're well run. Like they're a fantastic, well run club. Produces great players. Has fantastic players on their squad. They're just not big in terms of their crowds and their supporter base. And in reality, we see them in all different kind of competitions. Manchester
Hmm.
City, there's always that joke that they can't fill a stadium. They still average 52,000. I think probably the equivalent we could probably think of in Australia, at least I can, is the Sydney Roosters, who have been one of the leading teams in the NRL for the past decade, and yet their crowd averages are okay. But you would think, oh,
Yeah.
this team is enjoying success all the time. Wouldn't people want to come? But maybe their supporter base isn't that big, or maybe they're just happy to watch it from home. I don't know. For me, I think the club's a success. I think what they've
Hmm.
achieved in producing Socceroos, the quality they've got on the pitch, um, the opportunity they're giving to youngsters, I think they've been a great success. In terms of fan engagement, probably could be better.
Yeah, and look, I think they're moving the right way, and so that's one of the exciting things is maybe it's a lack of real identity where they actually belong, and so
Yeah.
they are heading down towards that southeast of Melbourne, Casey Fields. They're building their home base there, and that should be fantastic. That the hope, the kind of thoughts is maybe eventually they have a stadium down there, and I don't know if that's quite viable, but it's definitely a good there's lots to like about where they're
Yeah.
headed as a football club. They're here to stay, like the Manchester
Yeah,
City
but
mothers.
they'll never leave Melbourne, Amy
Yeah,
Park, because this is a stadium built for free for them. The government's paid for it. Why build a stadium down in Casey when they've got a perfect sized stadium in the middle of Melbourne, in the middle of the CBD?
I gotta pause. Hang on, sorry. No.
Well, welcome back again. Sorry for the brief technical issues there. Yeah, I think I've said everything I want to say about Melbourne City. I think they've been success, they've been a success kind of response. Yeah,
It's kind of funny. I almost would put them
or
as
maybe a
well.
pass mark.
I think yeah, Wellington are a more success than Melbourne City, and that's crazy because they've won an A League, they've won an FFA Cup, uh, like they're just an Australia Cup. Sorry,
Wait, who's won an Australia Cup?
well, Melbourne City.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were saying Wellington had. Yeah, okay, yeah.
No, no. So that's what I'm saying. Melbourne City have won an A League, they've won an Australia Cup, and yet, I don't know there's just something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
And
pass mark.
Wellington, I think there've been a number of New Zealand teams that just really hadn't captured the imagination. Now we've finally got
Yeah,
a team in
that's right.
Wellington who's been stable.
They've got
So,
an identity, they've got a fan base.
yep,
Melbourne City have to improve in that. So
yep,
yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on.
yep. All right. Well, let's move straight on to. Well, there was the Sydney Rovers in 2010 who were going to be an expansion team, but that ultimately failed. We won't go into that one. Let's go into 2012. The Western Sydney Wanderers. They came into the A League after Gold Coast collapsed, and the A League wanted a 10th team. For me, I think they're by far the most successful expansion team we've had. Um, yeah, I think their first season was a great success, and I still think a lot of the fans would hope to still enjoy that real boom success. But still, for me, I'd say they're the most successful expansion team. Probably probably the most successful expansion teams we've seen in Australia this century.
Yeah, and look, you look at what the Wanderers did right, and it's all about identity, right? They
Mm.
got the fans in on it straight away, choosing the colors, choosing the kit, choosing the badge, choosing the first signings,
Mm.
choosing the first captain. They knew their area, they knew who they were fighting against. They knew it was, East versus West, Sydney versus the West.
Mm.
And so those things really helped them grow a real clear identity, and people jumped on that. And those first couple of seasons were incredible. The crowds they were pulling, Parramatta or Pertex Stadium as it was perfect for them. That place was rocking quite often when they would play. They had some exciting young players. They weren't, the most amazing team, but they just worked together. They had this real kind of identity and ethic about them. And yeah, those things worked, and it has continued to work. Like we don't see the numbers turn up unless it's the Sydney Derby like we used to. But there's still that identity around the club. There's still, if you say the Wanderers, people know who you're talking about.
Mm.
Like they have an Australia-wide identity, and I think that's a real sign of a successful club.
Yep, yep, for sure. We might be pressed for a bit of time, so let's move on to the most recent inclusions into our competition, Western United and Macarthur FC. Western United joining 2019, Macarthur in 2020. For me, going into these two expansion teams, I thought Macarthur would probably be the better two because they defined their identity. I thought they had a really smart logo, connecting to a bit of history around that area in Campbelltown. And I just thought West United, a real generic name, playing all over the place, stadium hadn't been built. I think my opinions have switched now to West. I think Western are very firm, ingrained in the A League, and Macarthur are just shambles. I guess Western United still building that stadium. They've finally started building at least a training ground, and they're hopefully playing some games in it next season. But for me, I would say the jury's still probably out for these two teams. I think if Western United build this stadium, they'll be a success. If they don't, they'll probably fold. Macarthur, I just think they're doing everything wrong. I don't think you could do anything more wrong than they do, just with the pricing, engagement with the local community. For me, Macarthur's been a real disappointment because I thought they could be a lot more successful, but I think in a market already where there were two very well ingrained football clubs in Sydney, a West and a East, are very well represented. You know what side of the divide you're on. And then Macarthur came into this little tiny pocket in Western Sydney, and it just didn't make much sense. We know why these two teams. It was because of the Foxtel. They wanted another team in Sydney and Melbourne. So maybe we can blame David Gallop and Foxtel for that. But they're here now.
Yeah, we're kind of left with that lasting legacy. Look, I think still both teams have merit in that. Like you look at Western's kind of where they're aiming to be, where they've actually set up a base. It is a team for the future.
Yeah.
It was never a team for right now, but they did make some big promises. A stadium in 3 years, this, that, the other. And Tarneet hasn't yet quite blown up like it's supposed to. You and had a look, and it's still paddocks, but it's very much a team.
Very close to where they're building.
Yeah.
Like in the next 10 years, it'll explode.
And I think
it's just that keeps crawling.
I think that was always the idea behind them, and so I've always been willing to give them a little bit more time. I've always been willing just to let that simmer. Winning the A-League is never going to do you any harm, so that definitely helps that they're building an identity. So I think we've got to let them simmer. They will turn into a pretty big team, and I'm pretty sure of that. Macarthur is similar. Like you look at the Sydney Basin, you look at the way the growth is going out into those corridors in the West. Macarthur is also a team for the future. It's just that they should have had a team for the now as well. Like there should be support there now. You look at the Southwest, there's so much football culture there. You look at how many people play football in that area, in those local districts. They should have the supporter base now. There are so many people, and it should be there in the future. But that's the disappointing thing, is that they really should have started quicker than Western. They're not playing it, they're not based in a paddock. They're actually based in quite a big part of Sydney. And so that's disappointing. Whatever they're doing, it's not translating. I don't know how much they're out in community, but it doesn't seem to be actually growing anything. So it's disappointing to see, because again, football wise, like they were making some good moves there. But if Dwight York is to be believed, then the people running the club, there's something going on there. And I think we talked about it in a previous video. There was somebody who pulled out of the running of the club in like their first season.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
There's just things simmering that don't quite seem right, and that's disappointing. I think because of where the A-League is now, we know axing teams like North Queensland and Gold Coast probably isn't a good move. Actually keeping them around is good.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to get axed, but it'd be a real shame to see them never kind of grow with the potential that they have. There is great potential there. So look, of the two, I think Western United are probably a little bit more successful, and you have to give them a little bit more credit for where they're heading. Macarthur is a little bit more turbulent, and that's a bit disappointing.
Yeah, I really worry about Macarthur's future. But I really hope that they're here for the long haul, because I think, like you said, we can't afford to lose any more teams. So for me, I still think the jury's still out on me for these two teams. I think Western, like I said, build a stadium, they'll be great. Macarthur, we'll wait and see. But at the moment, I'd say they're a bit of a failure.
I guess the only question left, and where we might leave the video, is where next? When
Canberra.
next?
Canberra. Tomorrow. Maybe not tomorrow.
Obviously, we've had chats about that in the past, and we'll continue to chat through that in the future. But I think just having look, most teams have been successful. Most expansion teams that we've kind of gotten it right. And with hindsight, you go, maybe tweak a few things, and some of the clubs that disappeared probably could have been better and could still be with us today. But they're all lessons to learn for the future, and hopefully the next couple of teams, hopefully we get a couple more teams. Hopefully that'll be a lot smoother. Learning not just to do it for the money or for the Foxtel deal, but putting clubs where they can actually be successful, and having a better system. I think it's something we can learn from the MLS and the way they've done that. I know it's a very different kind of market, and they've got very different kind of financial situations, but you just look at a model close to ours and where the MLS has gone and where the A-League has gone. I think we've got lessons to learn, ways to do it better.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think we can wrap our things up there. Let us know in the comments where you'd like to see the new expansion teams and your opinions on the expansion teams we've had over the years. Remember, if your team is an expansion team or not an expansion team, you have to like the video. So thanks for doing that. Really appreciate it. It makes a heap of a difference. So we'll see you around.